Panels
things in
with
my
the
speech
shared
today.
history of
Firstly, I'll
South
give you
Korea and
3
Japan.
pieces of
South Korean
framing.
government
Secondly,
should
I
rather
will outline
actively
our
facilitate
propositions,
the
government's
remilitarization of
model.
Japan
And
in order
thirdly,
to
I will
counter
present
and cater
2
to the
arguments in
negatives and
support of
harms
government.
posed by countries like
Okay,
China
so let
and
me
North
start with the
Korea.
framing.
How to
In the
propose, right?
status quo,
What is the setup on
there are
OG? We will
many
be extremely
discussions
clear here.
surrounding
Firstly,
masculinity,
what is
and they often focus on
remilitarization,
the
right?
negative
So
aspects of traditional
remilitarization is
gender roles,
basically the
emphasizing
process by which
toxic
a country
masculinity and the
reestablishes
need
or
for their
basically
abolition.
enhances their military
This
capabilities
perspective
and
creates
defense
this
posture, which
confrontational
obviously
atmosphere
follow
which
things
aliens men who may
like
feel attacked
pacifism
for
or limited
behaviors that
military
are socially
engagement, right? This
conditioned
basically
rather
involves
than
increasing things
inherently
like military
harmful.
spending, expanding
The
the
second
armed
piece of
forces,
framing
or
is
developing things
identifying
like new weapons
problems
and
with the status
technologies,
quo,
and
and we
revising these
believe that
defense
in the
policies
status
to allow for
quo,
more proactive
by
military roles,
primarily
such as
emphasizing
collective
the need to
defense or
abolish
like
traditional gender
intervention
roles,
in
the
regional
movement
conflicts,
risks
where actually
overlooking the potential for positive
there
traits
would
that
be a
can also be
strengthened
associated with
military
masculinity.
under
And
our side.
because
And let's
this
give an
narrow
exclusive
focus can lead
context
to
in
a
this
lack
debate
of
about
constructive
Japan, right?
dialogue
Note
about
that
how men
remilitarization
can
marks a
also embody
significant
positive
shift from
traits
its
while
like
engaging in
post
roles
World War II
traditionally associated
pacifist
with their
stance, which
gender.
is driven by
And
rising
finally, the
security threats
stakeholders
from
of
like
this
a lot
debate
of
are
neighboring
both
countries and a
genders,
desire
including
to
men,
actually
women, as
strengthen
well as
these types
families
of
and
alliances,
communities. All of these
particularly
groups
with
which
countries like
have
the
an
United States
interest
and
in
other
how
regional partners, right?
masculinity is
So in
defined
this
and
debate then, it's
expressed,
really
which
crucial and
affects
important to
relationships,
understand
societal
that Japan's
dynamics, and overall
remilitarization
being.
represents this
Okay,
major change
so in the
from
status
its
quo, we would like
post-World
to,
War
in the
II
framing, we would like to
committed to
acknowledge
things like
this
pacifism,
idea
which
and concept of
emphasized avoiding
toxic
military conflict, right?
masculinity
So
as
basically, this
a
shift is
dominant
largely
form of
driven by increasing
masculinity,
security threats. Again, we
wherein
tell you from
men use like
countries
dominance,
also
violence,
like
and
from
control
North
to
Korea,
assert their power and
point
superiority,
missile and nuclear
or
programs, and
often in
China's
like
growing
methods of like
military
a collection
assertiveness,
of
right? Where as
offensive,
these
harmful
threats
beliefs, tendencies, and
intensifies,
behaviors
like
rooted
at the end of the
in
day,
male
the
roles
military
taken
capabilities and
to an
spending to
extreme.
actually better
And this is
protect itself
extremely
is
harmful to
something
women
crucial and
and is one
necessary
of
in
the
the first
key
place.
like
Because Japan also seeks to
key
strengthen
issues
things like
the
its
feminist
alliances with
movement
the
is
United
fighting
States
against.
and other
So in
regional
our model, we
partners,
would like to
which
create a
actually
narrative
aims
that
for a
addresses
more
the root
active role
cause
in regional
of
security
toxic
efforts. This is
masculinity by
the main
effectively
like goal of Japan in the first
countering
place,
with
right? So
positive
we tell you that there
masculinity, which
is
is
this
the most
urgency to
effective
actually
method of
strengthen the
neutralizing
military at
toxic
the end of the day.
masculinity.
But then secondly,
Since
what does it mean to facilitate
in the status quo
remilitarization under
right
our
now, like
side?
a lot
This
of
relates to our model where
social
our side supports
movements,
the active
people see
remilitarization of Japan,
because
right?
people see
So it basically
feminism
means like
as like a woman
they would be
exclusive
giving
issue instead of a
support by
men one. They
contributing
don't
to
see
things
how
like
men are
supplies
affected and
or
thus
actually
like
giving them the
learn
resources
earn
to do
less
so, right?
engagement.
So there would be this
In
active
our
support
model, we can
like
show
and
how men
like
can
we
also be
actually would
like
enable a
supporting good
country
allies
like
as
Japan to
like
strengthen its
supporting the
military
feminist movement. So
capabilities
both
and its
genders can
defense
fight together
posture,
in this
which it could actually
gender
look like various
for
actions
gender
like
equality
providing
basically.
diplomatic backing for increased
So
military
at its
spending
core,
and having that
feminist
joint
movement
military
fundamentally seeks
exercises and
equality for
encouraging
all
things like
individuals, regardless
collaborative
of
defense
gender. So
agreements
this
with their
includes like
allies, right? So
striving
it
to
also
like
may look
break
like, for
oppressive
example,
systems
sharing their
that
technology and resources, their
that
intelligence,
force
which actually
inequality and
advocates for these
advocating for the
legislative
rights and
changes that
recognition of
allow
all
for a more
groups.
proactive military role,
A
right?
significant
So,
aspect of this
what is our
movement
path to
is
victory then
addressing
in this
once
debate?
again
It's
like
two things, right?
the main issue of
We should
toxic
tell you that
masculinity, which refers
remilitarization is
to the
necessary for a
culture
stable,
norms that
for
associate
regional
masculinity with these
stability
harmful
and
traits,
at the
and
end of the day,
which these traits not
neighboring
only
countries like
harm
China
women
would
but also
not get their
negatively
territory and
impact men
etc.
by
And
like
both
defining
Japan
who
and
they are
South
and
Korea
leads to
stand to gain
like
regional
strained
stability,
relationships and
especially in
issues.
China's assertive
Um,
territorial claims
in
and
our
military
model, when men
expansion
understand
in
that
the
toxic
Asia Pacific
masculinity is
region. So in
harmful
and
not
of
only to
itself, we
women but
tell you
also
that Japan and
to
South
themselves and
Korea
their
have
peers,
some
they're
sort of
more
shared
likely to
history and shared
engage
interests
in
and goals in
positive
the first place, right?
conversations
So
about
we already
like
talked, and a quick
gender
characterization of the
equality and
status
like
quo is that there
recognize
is
that
already existing
like
trilateral
removing this
partnerships with
like
the United
toxic
States. There
masculinity is a
is already
shared
an existing
responsibility
motivation
between
for
both
Korea to
genders,
be engaged in
and it
Japan's
like creates more
remilitarization. So we think
unity and
that
collaboration
Korea
between
also
both
gains
genders.
technology and intelligence from
Second,
this,
it
which means
also
it's actually a
encourages
win-win
more men
solution
to
at
embrace
the end of
these
the day, right?
like
And let's be
positive
very clear about the
masculinity, which
line we
allows
draw
them
here.
to
I think that it's not
redefine
within
their
our burden to
identities so
defend
that they can like
Korea
align with
encouraging
these
Japan to
feminist
provoke other
values. And this
nations
shift
and start
in the
regional
narrative
conflicts,
empowers
but
men to
rather we
reject
think that the goal
previous
of
harmful stereotypes
remilitarization
and to
is rather to
advocate for their
promote
own like
national security
emotional
and to
well-being,
strengthen
which
existing
and
allyships, right?
is good
So
because
yeah,
the
moving on
impact
to the
of it is
arguments
it
then.
leads to
Firstly,
obviously,
healthier
why
relationship
the line,
for
I'll
both
take you
men
later,
and
with
women,
South
and
Korean
improves the
government's
issue
interest in the
by
first place, which is
resolving
obviously the
toxic
burden of proof in this
masculinity.
debate in order to
Once
take the
again,
debate, right?
the
So
main
quick context, what are the
issue that
interests of South
has
Korean government? It is
caused
simply
that
twofold.
feminist
Firstly,
movements and what
able
people are
to be able to
fighting
cater
for.
and fight against North Korea and other
What's good about our
neighboring
model is
countries that may
it
actually pose threats to
also
them. But then
promotes
secondly,
more
having
engagement
that
as a side
regional and
effect, because
national
now
stability, which
men
means
feel
they
more
would actually help
involved in
things like better
feminist issues,
security
and they
for their
feel
territory,
they
etc.
also have become
Moving on to the
advocates
first
for
analysis
change
about regional
and
security.
challenging these
Note that both South Korea and
these
Japan face a
ideas
lot
of
of
toxic
significant
behaviors,
threats, again,
not
from
only
North
for
Korea,
themselves, but
especially
also
with
for
its advanced nuclear
for the
weapons
other
and
gender
missile
and for the
capabilities.
communities.
This is to say that exactly
Now
because
moving
they're
on to my
allies,
arguments.
they have the
My
same
first
and mutual
argument
trust
is
and
about how
goals and
promoting
ideology. So
like
the
more
moment you
positive
actually support Japan's militarization,
masculinity
South
can
Korea
help
will have a better
dismantle
and
toxic
coordinated defense strategy
masculinity
to
in the
actually
most
counter these
effective
shared
method,
threats.
which is
Because when
one
two
of the
countries
feminist
emerges,
movement's
they're more
biggest
likely
goals.
going to counter these negative
What I mean
threats
by
from
this is
opposing
that
countries
like
effectively
focusing
and
on
better. As the
when
saying
we
goes, when
focus
there are
on
more
positive
people interfering or
masculinity,
groups
we
interfering,
create this
it will
like
be a stronger,
environment for
in a
men to
sense that,
challenge
to work actually exists in
without
the
feeling
day.
attacked
So
or
under this
defensive.
argument, why is it then
This
important to have
constructive approach
remilitarization and facilitate it,
then
given the current
encourages men
situation?
to reflect
Because
on their
firstly, given the threats from North
societal
Korea,
action
there
and the
is an
societal
urgency to
pressures
simply
that
enhance their
contribute to
defense systems,
toxic
right? We need to
masculinity.
create that strong base and foundation.
The logic
And
here is pretty
in terms of like
straightforward.
the
When
US
men
here,
feel
we
supported
tell you
in their
that as the
identities
US
and
shifts
are
its focus
encouraged to
towards
embody
like things
positive
like greater
traits,
power
they're more likely
competition,
to engage
having
in self-reflection. And this
remilitarization in Japan
self-reflection can
would
then
actually
lead to a
support the
critical
US strategic
examination of
objectives, which
previous
simply leads to
harmful
like a
toxic
strengthened
masculinity
connection
behaviors
and strengthened
traditionally
relation
associated with
between US and like
masculinity,
Japan and
including,
North
as mentioned
Korea,
before,
like
aggression,
and South Korea.
emotional
Where at the end of
suppression,
the
and
day,
dominance.
we tell you that
Now,
it would
by framing
contribute
the
to a
conversation
collective
around
defense
positive
efforts and
masculinity,
enhance that military
we then give
interoperability
these
and actually
men a new
participate in
opportunity
joint
to aspire
operations.
to be
Because Judge, we
to
tell you
embrace
that
new
US and
perspectives and
Japan,
be better without the fear of
like
being
US
labeled
and
as
Japan,
last
weak or
point.
Korea are
inadequate or
crucial
like
pillars
not fitting
for
their
regional security
traditional
in East
gender
Asia, which means that
role
under
or
our side, we
stereotypes.
strengthen the connection
Why
and
should you care about
diplomacy
this?
between US,
Because
South Korea, and
addressing
Japan,
toxic
which allows them to
masculinity
actually have
through the
stability
lens
in
of
the Asia
positive
Pacific region. But before
masculinity
moving on, I'll take
is
that
the
to you on.
most effective and inclusive
Yeah,
method that
Japan and
encourages
South Korea have had
stable
really bad
growth and
historical
accountability
tensions.
among men too.
Specifically, Japan has
The
grown
shift in
towards
the
on South
narrative
Korea.
also
How
not
do you
only
think
benefits
the
men by
South
reducing
Koreans would
like mental
react
health
if
issues
they supported this?
associated
If the
with
government
Interesting, right?
supported
norms,
I'll literally engage
but
that
also
after
creates
this. But then we already told you that
a
at the
more
end of the day,
safer and
Japan and
respectful
Korea has a
environment for
shared
everyone in
history,
society,
which
is
means they have
beneficial
these
for
mutual
feminist
threats and
movements.
like mutual
Because a culture that
they
values
have similar
positive
goals in the first
masculinity
place,
is
which
likely
means
to
they
see
would be
decreases
able
in
to actually
violence,
create that stronger
harassment, and other
foundation to actually
harmful
like
behaviors
cater
for women,
to the
which
threats given by
resolves
neighboring
once again
countries, right?
the
But then third
fundamental
analysis then
issues
about
that
international
the
peacekeeping and
feminist movement is
cooperation
fighting against.
responsibility. We tell you that supporting
Now,
remilitarization
moving on to my
policies
second
actually
argument is that
positions South
when we
Korea
promote
as a
positive
responsible leader
masculinity,
in
we also
international
align with the
peacekeeping and
broader goals
operation,
of
right? Because the moment
feminist
you
goals of
enhance
equality
their
and social
military
justice.
capabilities,
What I
South
mean by
Korea
this
would
is that
actively contribute
when
to
men are
things like regional
encouraged to
security and
embrace
stability,
positive
right?
traits, it
You would
contributes to more
reinforce its
equitable
commitment to
society
multilateral
because we're
efforts in
redefining
addressing
what
common challenges such as
masculinity
things
is
like
and challenging
humanitarian crises
patriarchal
or
norms.
terrorism in general.
This means
So
that
this
like
approach basically
it
not only
contributes to the
strengthens the
feminist movement's
partnership
aim
with
of
their
achieving gender
allies, but also
equality
enables South
when men
Korea to
participate in
participate
different aspects
meaningfully
like
in the international
empathy and
peacekeeping
like
missions, which
more
showcases its
caring
willingness
like
to actually uphold
aspects of
that
them,
global
and
peace and
it
security, which
deconstructs
means that you
traditional
actually
ideas
further
about gender
enhance
roles in
the
society,
cooperation
which leads
responsibility,
to better gender equality
in
as
the
a whole.
first place. Because the moment you shoulder its
in
share of
conclusion,
defense
side with the
responsibilities,
government. Thank
South
you.
Korea would actually enhance its
3 things from my
reputation on the
speech today.
world
Firstly, I will give
stage,
you
fostering
3 pieces
trust
of
and
framing. Secondly,
collaboration
I
with
will
other
outline
nations,
our
which is obviously
propositions
crucial in the
the
first place.
government's model. And
With
thirdly,
all
I
those
will
reasons
present
that I'm
2
incredibly proud
arguments in
to
support of government.
propose.
Okay, so
women are still being killed in many parts of the world because the men and law alike see women as lesser than men. In a world where women still face major discrimination and harm from a patriarchal society, the feminist movement, a beacon of light that has supported women first and foremost through recent history, should not betray the ones it has sworn to protect. Proud to oppose. Set up then. Firstly, on what does positive masculinity actually look like? O would posit that positive masculinity is the opposite of toxic masculinity, and the promotion of positive masculinity would allow for men to be more in touch with their emotions and advocate for their own agency. Some stakeholder analysis here then. We think that many progressive or even moderate men would like to see this in society, and they would support the feminist movement if this were their main agenda. Note that these men are usually already supportive of the feminist movement, or at least want gender equality. Secondly, we think that many women would dislike this agenda because the movement that was primarily focused on them previously has turned to a different group of stakeholders they want to protect, which does inherently not focus on them. But thirdly, we think most importantly, conservative men would still not support this movement because they like toxic masculinity. It inherently gives them more power, and therefore they don't want to be seen as weak. They don't want to be seen as sensitive. They still want to be seen as strong, and they don't want the feminist movement to tell them what to do. Therefore, we think that this policy would not turn more people to the feminist movement in that aspect. But we think that the missing link that OG fails to prove is why the feminist movement is the necessary actor to create this change. If men want to have this policy for themselves, it is possible for them to stand up for themselves, especially in a patriarchal society. We think that this link is extremely crucial to OG's case. We'll disprove this in our second argument. But secondly, what would we characterize to be the abolishing of gender roles then? We would specifically characterize the abolishing of gender roles to mean 2 things. Firstly, we get rid of social narratives that women should stay at home and cook and clean and take care of children, or that women are weak and always kind or sensitive, by educating the public about other alternative paths, such as working women or even not marrying, and allowing for the feminist movement to push these ideals into basically into society, right? But secondly, we would say that the feminist movement instead would focus on lobbying for policy that makes it possible for women to get into places of power, such as through policies like affirmative action, like gender quotas, or like paid maternity leave for both men and women. This is to say, we believe that women's rights should inherently come from change in policy, structural barriers, and narratives that uniquely impact women. First argument then about the positive of how positive masculinity does not assure change for women. 4 questions within this argument then. Firstly, what is the main problem in this debate? We think that the biggest problem in status quo up until this point is a lack of capacity for women to have the same opportunities and power as men. That is to say, firstly, people in developed countries, for example, in the Middle East, are targeted and there's violence against these women, or even in Korea, where it is still a very developed country compared to a lot of other countries, but women have the highest rape and women-based violence rate in the world. Secondly, we think that in conservative areas, women are tied down to gender roles in their own homes. This is something we ought to regret because these women often do not know if they have the agency to do the things that they want. And even then, we think that they still do not have the capacity to change their lives because of social norms and barriers that are stacked against them. But thirdly, even in the most developed areas, in the most developed countries, women are seen in places of power because they are discriminated against, and there's often a glass ceiling. This is to say, we see that most lawyers, engineers, and politicians are men. We think that we should continue the trend of change, which we see is happening in status quo currently, and not turn to men who are already doing well enough by their own. We would further argue that these issues are more important than the ones men face, or at least the feminist movement seeks to equal out the discrimination women have faced historically. The side that wins the debate is the bench that can prove they solve these issues. Secondly, then, how does positive masculinity positively necessarily impact men or benefit men? We think that men are often subject to toxic masculinity norms and have extreme amounts of pressure placed on them, to the extent that it is very honorable for OG to stand up for this policy that will allow men to openly feel more emotion and connect with their children, etc. However, we would posit that OG's narrative is extremely shallow in the sense that the feminist movement should not be the one supporting this. That is to say, women have faced a historical historical timeline of violence and discrimination that has stretched over centuries. I think that the feminist movement has historically done this. I think it's unfair for them to betray the people that they have sworn to protect throughout history and through right now as well. Then thirdly, discussing some opportunity cost. When a movement focuses on one thing, it is extremely unfeasible for them to subvert resources into another thing as well, because this diverts the amount of bargaining power they have with government and citizens. I think that the link between men's rights improving and women's rights improving is incredibly weak. That is to say, even OG doesn't tell us that when men's rights improve, women's rights will improve. That is to say, when men get more emotional and accepting of gender norms, they will not be okay with women's rights improving as well. The reason why this is not the case is because men will only necessarily care for themselves. If their lives are getting better, great, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they want women to have the same power as them because they're benefited by the patriarchal society of today. This is extremely this can be applied to very conservative men, which are the main opposition of the feminist movement anyways. Second argument then about buy-in. Firstly, how do social movements lobby structural change? We would argue that the prerequisite for getting structural change is for the movement to have a great societal impact from the get-go, insofar as we prove to you how that kind of societal support and greater buy-in from people, that is when we get the more ability and power to convince the government to enact changes in policy that actually have a greater large-scale impact towards the very people that the feminist movement wants to protect. But note that we have the power to better convince more people to support the movement, because the reality is that under our side of the house, we are seen as much more radical. That is to say, we clearly differentiate ourselves from the rest of society and clear a clear image and want change, which is what makes people interested in the movement from the get-go. We think that erring on the side of caution and choosing not to be radical is a dangerous stance as a movement, because at the same time it may also mean that no one becomes interested in the movement. That is to say, under our world, we're able to reach a wider audience through sparking discourse by utilizing this controversy. This means that we can have women, famous women that have been impacted by these feminist issues speak out against what they have faced and things like that. We see this in the Me Too movement as well as many other feminist movements in current society. But secondly, how do social movements create narrative change? We would argue that the best way to create narrative change is for the feminist movement to garner the most amount of people supporting the movement. We're also best able to achieve that because number one, we already proved to you how we reach a wider audience, and secondly, note that we get more public buy-in. Thirdly, then, why is that positive masculinity is an unstrategic route for the feminist movement? Firstly, men will see this as an attack. Under our side, it is significantly harder to get more change and support from people in the first place. This is especially important when trying to garner more support for these moderate supporters who are swinging in between and swinging not between supporting feminism. Gov is more likely to lose these followers who are in between. But secondly, this change is not policy focused. That is to say, simply trying to convince men to like the movement and trying to spread this agenda. We would argue that the priority of the movement should be to maximize tangible changes and impacts that can be seen through improving the lives of the people who they want to protect, which the priority should be women and those who are the minorities of society. Note that this point is important because it means that on the comparative, it's actually really difficult for the movement to get proper buy-in. That is, we're changing the stance of the entire movement for the point as which we tell you that GovBench cannot actually get proper buy-in even from men. Then why is this exclusive to our side? Under GovBench, they're not able to tell you any societal or structural change at the point in which we prove to you that it is really difficult for them to garner enough social support to do so. Very proud to oppose.
All right, 3 things in this speech. First, I'll give a rebuttal to the first opposition speaker. Then I'll give the summary of the clashes and why we win, and a comparative on the best case and worst case scenario of each side. So it seems like opposition has just completely not listened to our arguments, and they just didn't pick up on anything we said, because we are saying that we want to not protect men. We are not focusing on men. We mech'd it in the first speaker. We are here to help women by promoting positive masculinity. They are still the focus of these feminist movements. We never said we wanted to focus on the men, and I don't know where they got this from. So they also said that they should, with the main focus of feminism, and basically if we don't focus on men as well, men will eventually fall behind, and that's not what we want. But right now, we are saying that positive masculinity is also going to help women, which opposition clearly has just not listened to. We also said that they also don't say how this, how they get better on their side, because they define these gender roles as I guess, women being weak and harmless or stuff like that, but that's different. Gender roles are what people are thought to be. So like, for example, women to be housewives. Gender stereotypes are women being weak and stuff like that. So these are 2 completely different things. And they suggest policies such as quotas, maternity leave, etc. And their entire case basically is not on what the motion is saying. They're suggesting maternity leave. That's not part of abolishing gender roles. So that just doesn't work in their case. And their policy is just completely incorrect. They also talk about conservative men and how that's our biggest opposition. But are they really that naive to think that this wouldn't happen on their side either? Do you think if these women get suddenly promoted into power, that these conservative men wouldn't protest against that? If these conservative men already are rejecting positive masculinity, which is actually quite a small step, how do you think they will react to women suddenly getting pushed into power? Of course, they wouldn't react well. So that's even worse on their side. And they haven't proven why they can, I guess, solve this problem of conservative men on their side. And they also talk about people being disinterested in the feminist movement because supporting females is what they, I guess, joined in the first place to do. But we already said that more people will want to join, because with a little bit of support from men, because men will be seen not as toxic, but because positive masculinity will redefine what masculinity is, then these men will also want to join the feminist movement, which means that we'll actually get more people instead of less people. And we once again would like to emphasize that equality is the main goal of these feminist movements, not making women better. Okay, so now I'll move on to the 2 main clashes that's happened so far in this debate. So firstly, on the issue of which approach, abolishing gender roles or prioritizing positive masculinity, is more effective in achieving the feminist movement's fundamental goals. We win this clash because we are able to show that prioritizing positive masculinity directly addresses the harmful aspects of toxic masculinity while creating an inclusive environment for all genders. Opposition, on the other hand, just gives us, basically, they say we want to promote women, we want to give them more power, and they don't have no, I guess, their policy isn't even on abolishing gender roles. And but by focusing on this positive masculinity, we invite men to engage in the conversation, which allows them to redefine their roles in a way that aligns with these feminist values, which once again gets more people to join the movement. And this inclusion is crucial for building a coalition that could effectively advocate for equality, making it clear that positive masculinity supports the feminist movement's goal of dismantling these patriarchal norms. Before I continue, do you have any POIs? 3, 2, 1. Okay. The second main clash, or the final clash, is regarding the effectiveness in each approach about fostering this collaboration or engagement among genders. And we were able to demonstrate that in proposition's case, in our case, this effectively addresses the potential pitfalls that have been identified by opposition. And by advocating for for positive masculinity, we create the framework that encourages men to see themselves as allies rather than adversaries in the feminist feminist movement, which does not happen once again on opposition side. And this empowerment leads to increased advocacy and for equality and a willingness to participate in these discussions for gender roles. And in contrast, an approach focused solely on abolishing gender roles, which opposition once again does not even provide, risks reinforcing divides between genders. And men may feel marginalized and alienated by a movement that seeks to disregard or criticize their experiences and identities. And this alienation can lead to disengagement, where men withdraw from conversations about gender equality altogether, believing that these discussions do not pertain to them or they are unwelcome participants, which once again, the feminist movements need all the help they can get. So this is not what they're trying to do. And so our model not only promotes healthier relationships by encouraging men to express vulnerability and empathy, but also strengthens the feminist movement by creating collaboration and shared responsibility among all genders. So in our best case comparison, when we prioritize positive masculinity in our world, our scenario includes healthier relationships because, like I said, men who embrace positive masculinity are more likely to engage in nurturing and empathetic behaviors. And as a result, relationships, whether romantic, familial, platonic, whatever, become more supportive and emotionally fulfilling. 2, a reduction of toxic masculinity, which, like my first speaker said, is one of the main goals or one of the main barriers or obstacles of the feminist movement. Because by framing masculinity positively, we actively challenge and dismantle these toxic behaviors, which leads to a significant cultural shift. And men are empowered to reject aggression and dominance and instead adopt traits that promote cooperation and emotional intelligence. And this cultural transformation benefits everyone because it creates an environment of respect and understanding. And 3rd, increased participation in feminist goals because men feel invited to engage with these feminist principles, seeing them as relevant in their own lives. And this leads to a more inclusive movement where men advocate for equality alongside with women. So in conclusion, I'm proud to propose. Thank you.
I just want to quickly characterize. Note here that a social movement has limited public attention that they are able to garner in a lot of cases. So under their side of the house, when the main focus is trying to convince all of these men that they need to be included into this social movement, that this narrative of toxic masculinity that a lot of the men have bought into for so long, so many years, that has been deeply rooted in society, you're trying to unconvince them of that narrative. We would argue that it takes a lot of social capital and a lot of that attention off of other issues, and we prove to you why that trade-off is simply not worth it. Before anything, a few strategic observations. First of all, I just want to characterize. Note that this debate is also about making an active trade-off as a social movement. That is to say that the feminist movement has limited public attention and time to focus on some things. Therefore, if they choose to prioritize and endorse one thing, that ends up putting down and drowning out another issue. A consideration to then be made, and something that this debate ought to be about, is what should the feminist movement then prioritize to focus on? We would posit that at that point, the priority isn't endorsing positive masculinity, but simply pushing a more general, accurate stance that gender is arbitrary and also focusing on the victims of these societal patriarchal norms. But secondly, I just want to reframe this debate. What does Gov's world and stance of endorsing positive masculinity actually look like? They try to argue that is about promoting equality, but obviously that is not likely to be the case, because if they want to get that benefit of allowing men to somehow feel included with the social movement, obviously you're not going to again start focusing on women, but obviously that requires having to focus and break down these narratives that have specifically affected the men. Things like breaking down toxic masculinity. We would argue that then that takes a lot of attention on trying to focus on the issues that specifically only men face in society. On the comparative, note that abolishing gender roles looks like the following: creating a narrative that gender is arbitrary in society, trying to fight for more recognition of the victims. Note here that abolishing gender roles includes allowing women to take the career paths that they want, because a very prevalent gender role is that women stay at home and are housewives. That is to say that the best way to counteract this kind of narrative of patriarchy is actual policy and structural change that makes it possible for women to have the same opportunity cost as men. That is why our setup still stands. But thirdly, we think that side proposition has this trade-off that they can only focus on one thing at a time because of opportunity cost. And that is to suggest that when you're empowering men first, you cannot tackle issues like gender roles that affect women, such as women can't do STEM, women must stay at home and be housewives, or women's consent doesn't matter, or women are too sensitive to be effective leaders. We tell you previously that there are more pressing issues that affect women. The actor both sides implicitly seem to agree in this debate to be the most vulnerable in this debate. At the end of this opening exchange then, the very least we prove to you is that it is better to directly tackle the most important issue first and tackle other harms like the fact that men do not know how to have proper relationships afterwards. Before anything then, a direct response. First of all, OG tells you that the feminist movement is more likely to garner support under their world. Why is it that men will not buy into the feminist movement if they advocate for women's change? Note here that our most important analysis was that men will see this as an attack against their ability and their life. Extremely conservative men already have the view that the feminist movement as a movement that wants to control their actions and limit their ability to do things in their life. We think that then OG does not prove why more men who are currently not supporting gender equality will then suddenly magically buy into the feminist movement exclusively under their side of the house. And this analysis is important here because we tell you women will support the feminist movement less if it is not empowering them and instead empowering the people that they view to have set up the patriarchal society. OG has not given us a proper analysis and mechanism on why more men will support the feminist movement, and that therefore suggests that the net support explicitly decreases under OG at the point in which men feel as though their ability and autonomy is being undermined because they're being questioned of a narrative that they have bought into for so many generations throughout their entire life. And now quickly, I just want to rebuild our second argument on how we enact better public change and how we get better buy-in. An additional impact that I would like to posit here is how we get higher quality supporters. And this is likely to occur because we simply proved to you previously, and I'll prove to you further on in my extension, why our world of abolishing just gender roles in general is a more accurate depiction of things that the feminist movement wants to support from the get-go. And that's likely because it has a much more general narrative of supporting every single minority that the feminist movement stands for in society, such as women and such as queer people. And why is this so important? Because that means that we get more supporters who are most likely victims in society, those who have felt the kind of discrimination before, and not just extremely privileged men who are simply less just generally factually less discriminated upon in society. And the reason getting higher quality supporters who resonate with the stance of the movement much more is so important is because that is when you get more quality supporters who are willing to protest on the streets and are actually willing to fight for change and try to convince the government to change and create more policy differences. Under your world, even in your best case that you do garner the support of men, that does not matter at the point in which the men do not care. They just want the best for themselves. That is literally why they bought into this narrative in the first place. So you're not likely to get any further change after that for the rest of the movement and for the rest of the minorities in the movement. We tell you that at least under our world, at the point in which we do get kind of public buy-in, that public buy-in further adds on to helping the other minorities within the movement. If we get public buy-in, maybe we'll be willing to focus on the additional, addressing toxic masculinity later on. So now before I move on to extension, I'll take a POI from closing.
Okay. So if you're not going to address toxic masculinity first, then what are you going to address?
We tell you just literally generally abolishing gender roles in the first place, trying to address equality, the fact that certain women are limited from achieving their dreams. That's creating more equality and abolishing the roles from the first place. So now let me move on to my extension on how we protect people within the movement. What is the priority and stance of the feminist movement? Note that the very purpose of the movement was created to focus on 1, fighting for societal, legal, and legal recognition, and 2, to protect and raise awareness and solidarity for the victims such as societal issues. This is important here because this argument stands even in the very best case of the entire gov bench that they do somehow include men and allow men to feel included in societal, because we prove to you why the priority should be protecting these victims. Secondly, note that these minorities are drowned out under gov's world. I think that it is quite obvious here that the most disenfranchised are women and not men, but also people like queer people. And the fundamental flaw then that they do not recognize is that their narrative is not an umbrella narrative that helps all these people, but only the men. Why is this drowning out likely to occur? Because focusing on endorsing positive masculinity only focuses on exclusively those affected by toxic masculinity. Because we tell you what we tell you at our first speech, that is so difficult to convince men to even buy into these things, we're wasting attention. But thirdly, positive masculinity fails to address the root problem of these underlying issues in society. For example, it's just patriarchal norms in general that has resulted in toxic masculinity. It is our world that truly addresses that. So proud to propose.
OG has no mechanism and OO has pessimism. OG does not prove why exactly social movements would be feminist movements would be better off while supporting positive masculinity, they only stop at the conclusion that, oh, men will feel less attacked and therefore they'll be more willing to support the movement. We would like to broaden the scale, not just towards men, but towards anyone that is not currently supporting the feminist movement. For all this, so proud to propose. Before anything, what is the main metric of winning this debate? We would say that the most important and most influential factor of any social movement, not just feminism, is the support that it gains. That is to say that we should not be getting ahead of ourselves and already thinking about what tangible change and whatever is made when the movement itself doesn't have enough support to begin with. Social movements succeed when they go step by step, and that starts by slowly shifting and tweaking the narrative set on men bit by bit, not by completely suddenly erasing all of the social narratives and all of the gender roles that have existed for centuries and that society has basically already adapted to. Therefore, we want to call out OG for not having a clear setup for what feminism on their side will look like. So let's make that clear right now. In CG, we think that feminist movements advocating for positive masculinity would start pushing a narrative of kind and empathetic men, which would reduce the counter narrative of toxic masculinity on op benches. Feminist movements would use that description of positive masculinity that OG correctly gives you and use that to promote a sense of community and coming together of both genders in some senses. But I'll explain that more in my extension coming up soon. Before moving on then, some responses. Starting with OG. The most unique contribution coming from OG is that basically, when feminism supports positive masculinity that aligns with the broader goals of equality and justice. Again, we don't think that there's enough mechanism or logic behind why necessarily men will be more willing to support that, or why anyone, not just men, will be more willing to support feminist movements. Therefore, we don't think they can win based on pragmatics and magnitude of how much support they would actually be able to garner, or how many audiences they would actually be able to target other than solely men. But moving on to OO then, their contribution is that abolishing gender roles like stay-at-home housewives and working men and whatnot leads to more tangible change like gender quotas in the workplace and affirmative action. Firstly, on the idea that it's principally unjust for feminist movement to suddenly change their focus away from women towards instead men. Obviously, all social movements need to make trade-offs. But when it comes to feminism, we see in status quo that a lot of people are entirely disinterested in the feminist movements because essentially they just seem like a bunch of women making a ruckus and marching through the streets while only supporting each other. And a lot of people don't get the actual message that they're trying to push. We'll explain more why eventually when you support positive masculinity, that will allow more people to be more willing to listen to them. But secondly, we would rather prioritize support for the feminist movement before regulations and policies like affirmative action. So let's compare these two things because that seems to be the main difference between opening half and closing half. Again, the point of social movement is to improve the reputation and image of the social movement. It doesn't matter whether 50% of the leadership positions of Google are female, and it doesn't matter if more and more politicians become women, if there is minimal attention and support for women and for the feminist movement from the very get-go. We would rather start moving towards making this tangible change after feminist movement has enough followers and support, because that would lead to a more positive reaction to these regulations for women. The conclusion of this response is to say that support for social movement is what gives the social movement's bargaining power. You could consider it a prerequisite. Companies would be willing to implement gender quotas in their leadership positions if that decision will be met with enough support in the first place. But the support for feminist movements cannot be achieved on oppositions, and that is what my extension is all about. Before moving on to the third response, I'll take the POI from OO.
The feminist movement has destroyed the lives of male celebrities who have raped women celebrities. How can you say that the feminist movement has no bargaining power?
Because nobody supports the feminist movement. Sure, feminist movement does expose things like sexual assault and rape, but that just makes it harder for people like men or for other people to like genuinely listen to the feminist movement, thinking that they're exaggerating or taking too large of steps to increase their movement. But I'll talk about that more into my extension. Thirdly, we completely reject the notion that men will feel attacked with positive masculinity that LO tries to push. Men do not feel attacked when their image, often matched or characterized with negative connotations of aggression, superiority, or dominance, when this is alleviated and no longer imposed, it is quite clear that they don't feel attacked nor targeted. In fact, they would probably be thankful that now they don't have to live under the idea that they always have to be strong and they always have to be like, and that they always have to align with toxic masculinity, essentially. Moving on to extension then about how abolishing gender roles is essentially counterproductive. Premise here that totally getting rid of gender roles is something that's virtually impossible, and feminist movements should not try to rely on this as their main method of support. 3 questions to ask here then. Firstly, why is this the case? Note that gender roles have existed within society for centuries. Women have always been viewed as housewives and stay-at-home workers, and that narrative still exists in status quo. Sorry for the background noise. That is why feminist movement doesn't gain a lot of attention these days. And here's the logic and mechanism behind this that OG does not have. People view them as radical social movements that wish for and advocate for unrealistic goals, such as totally wiping out these prominent gender roles. I think people would be more likely to listen to and support a movement that seems to have achievable goals set in place, such as preserving current gender roles for men, but with a slight twist to it and with a slight difference. Let's differentiate ourselves from OG then. OG's logic is quite shallow, and they basically jump straight to the conclusion that men will be more willing to participate and take interest in feminist movement just because they no longer feel attacked. We broaden the scope and the perspective of not just men, but anyone else that wasn't originally in the feminist movement. We need to think of what is most important for the social movement and what will bring the movement the most support from more audiences. Secondly, really quickly, why is this especially harmful? Abolishing gender roles is an illusion of solvency, as it is more important to address root causes of gender inequality, such as power dynamics or gender expectations, rather than solely focusing on abolishing gender roles and running away from them. Thirdly, why is our side different, and why does our side solve the above problems? We see that men would be happier with this new narrative towards them. Many men, especially younger generations, are sick of the idea that they always need to do the hard work, etc., but they still want to keep the general perception that they are strong individuals. That being said, the options of A, completely wiping out the current perceptions like toxic, like masculinity, and getting entirely rid of gender roles and keeping the stereotypes as they are both not optimal for men. That being said, it will be more likely for men to support the feminist movement. They feel like they're acknowledged and perceived correctly for who they truly are as strong men, but as ones who don't always have to live up to the standards of toxic masculinity. For all these reasons, so proud to propose.
I think that opening half is still locked up in the traditional archaic binary framework of that the struggle is between men and women. But we think that the feminism has to actually transcend beyond the binary framework that puts genders as polar opposites. In closing, we show how the deconstruction of gender roles is the way to liberate all human beings from gender constructs, which will allow all human beings, women and men alike, to actually freely self-actuate their own sexuality in their own unique ways. But before that, a few points of engagement. First, towards OG. First, we understand that it's actually important to empower men as well. But the problem with their approach is that they still box the way in which men can define their own gender identity within the framework of masculinity. So you said that even if we call it actually positive masculinity, it's masculinity nonetheless. So they do nothing for men who actually wish to be actively feminine because it's all within the framework of masculinity. But second, I think that they're risking alienating masculine men who shouldn't be told they only have one option, but their gender exists on a spectrum, and therefore they have to elect to define their gender at any point on the gender spectrum. Our extension will show how we actually better attain that goal. So second point on how we actually address the closing government's extension and that they actually make men nicer. First, I think that even if men become nicer, it doesn't really structurally change the patriarchal structures that still lock women in the mindset that they still have to subscribe to pre-existing gender norms that confine women to femininity. We say even if men are nicer, then there really isn't no psychological change that you make a woman's part, which is why their policy of feminism doesn't really truly empower them, right? So we said it only mitigates women's oppression slightly at best, but it doesn't really do anything for the women themselves. So we said they still lock women into the oppressive frameworks of patriarchy. So now onto my two extensions. We think that the OO really sees everything as a zero-sum game. So we don't disagree, but why can feminism actually embrace all humans of diverse cultures better than making this into a universal struggle? So first extension on what is feminism and how does supporting positive masculinity counter the goal of feminism. I think that the goal of feminism has been about promoting the rights and status of women, but this goal is only meaningful insofar as that it liberates women from the gender constructs that oppresses women. That is, we say that feminism may be about protecting women, but this is essentially because they want to attain the larger goal of promoting the freedom of human beings of their choice to construct their own gender identities in a way that actually conforms to their own values and ideals. So why is this analysis of feminism so important under our model? Two reasons. We think that this analysis shows that feminists, so that when feminists actually promote positive masculinity, it's wrong because it still buys into the narrative that there are particular standardized ways to actually define gender norms for men. You're still saying that men ought to be masculine, even if it is to lesser degree, instead of saying that men can define their own gender identity by a spectrum or by a wider degree of diversity in which infinitely diverse on a gender spectrum. But within that sense, you largely confine the way in which men actually define their own gender identity as masculine. You still create a binary distinction of defining gender identity, which does nothing to actually change the ways in which women define themselves. But second, this also means that women are confined in the liberty of constructing their gender identity because they still have to define themselves within the confines of femininity. I think that this is bad because there may be many women who want to define themselves in various ways in the spectrum of gender identity, but by saying that men have to be masculine, although to a lesser degree, I think that the proposition bench, they still prevent women from defining themselves in masculine traits, which reduces the choices they have in defining themselves, right? So we said they don't really actually show the true meanings of femininity as well under their model. So second extension on why this actually helps women. So why is it then abolishing gender roles the better approach for feminism? Two responses. First, I think that abolishing gender roles most critically empowers women themselves. This is because it also encompasses the notion that women themselves should also define their gender identity on the infinite gender spectrum as well. The message is not that women are feminine and men can also be feminine. Rather, it's that all human beings can construct their gender identity freely and diversely, which actually promotes the larger goal of liberating all genders from gender constructs. But second, OO advocates for traditional feminism in promoting women's interest, but by often seeing women's interest as well competing with men. The limitation with this approach is that patriarchal societies are unwilling to actually embrace feminism and they're most likely going to actively reject their proposals to promote women's rights. I think that when feminism actually starts to say that all genders need to be liberated from gender roles, they actually allow for the movement to invite men who are also shackled from gender constructs that also constrict men as well. So I think this means that closing opposition is capable of three things. First, we think that we're capable of helping not just women, but also men at a larger scale, because we actually extend the gender spectrum and we give both of them free choice to be whatever they want, right? We don't really see like these men and women as polar opposite genders, but we said there's an infinite spectrum in which they can identify themselves as. But second, I also think that we can also create more social capital to actually include men who would be more willing to promote deconstructing all gender roles, which can actually benefit women. I think that this means under our model, there's more likely to support policies that actually help women because they see it as a part of a larger mission of helping men as well, right? So we think that in the long term, we actually help men also support this movement under our model. So while OO wants to attain this same goal, CO, I think that really our side, CO, shows how this can actually be better attained by universalizing the fight for gender freedom. But thirdly, finally, we tell women that they should actively define their own gender in a way that they want, which is different from everyone else. I think that this really empowers women, oppressed or not, because it gives them a new framework that actually helps both men and women, and they actually are able to lie on like a different diverse gender spectrum.
In today's patriarchal society, simply arguing as a woman for my rights is not going to happen, nor is going to get me anywhere. Supporting positive masculinity emphasizes that addressing gender inequalities is a collective effort with shared responsibility, where both genders have to cooperate for a woman to be viewed as equal beings no lesser than men. Moving on to two main clashes of debate in which I will integrate additional rebuttals for each bench. First clash, how does this proposed motion affect the capacity and ability of feminist groups to approach gender inequalities? First, it's quite clear that the ability of feminists feminist
today,
groups
I'm going
to
to prove why
address
each
toxic
opening
agendas are not
team is
impaired. Why
effectively
positive
boxed out of today's
masculinity
debate,
addresses
why
harmful
closing team is
stereotypes and promotes
closing
healthy
debate is more
emotional
important,
expression,
and
which
even why I'm
benefits
closing, we have
everyone. We
one
see it as a
on each single
necessary
clash
step
on each
towards
relevant
achieving gender
relation on
equality.
today's debate.
By
Now,
including
let's just
discussions
move
of positive
let's move on proving
masculinity,
why
feminist
OG
groups
is
can
boxed out
engage
of
men in
today's
conversations
debate. Let
about
me just
gender
remind you,
inequality,
we
which is
all
a
really
broader
appreciate
coalition
the
for
caution
change.
they have
Supporting
exercised
positive
on this sense of
masculinity
matter,
then
but what they
emphasizes
did
that
is
addressing
exercise
gender
too much caution.
inequalities is
They
a
had absolutely
collective
no
effort, and it
mechanism
encourages
whatsoever, as
men
my
to
member
take the
said. My
responsibility
member only
for
explains the
dismantling
best OG
harmful
is
stereotypes and narratives
does give
surrounding them
big
and
gains on
behaviors
benefits
which
of what
lighten the
happened.
burden
They
on
can't
women
take
to
credit for
advocate
these
for change
ideas is
alone.
because
And
without
this
my
collective
members'
understanding
mechanism,
of
these
gender
arguments can't
inequality
stand
issues
at
are
all.
important
All
as
they're
men
doing in
have
this
to
debate is
understand the
laundry
shared
listing a bunch
responsibility
of
that
widely
they
known
have in
facts
order
of what
to
the
advocate
political
for the
status quo
correct
and saying
change.
the benefits
We
would
think
be
addressing
more
toxic
alliance.
masculinity
But
through
they failed to
positive
prove is one,
masculinity
why
is the
Japan will be
we think
incentivized to be
addressing
the
toxic
middleman of this huge
masculinity through the
conflict.
positive
Two, why
masculinity is the correct approach.
Why
As
South
promoting
Korea's
positive
status quo
masculinity
requires the
allows for
government
the
to actively
redefinition, a
sacrifice
flip
the
of the
trade-off
table
of
for what it
heightened
means to be
military
a man,
tensions
breaking
between
down
North
these
Korea.
rigid
Our
norms
member made
that
an
can be harmful
extremely
to
detailed
both men
analysis
and
on why
women, and
Japan
this
is
redefinition
incentivized to help
process
South Korea.
can
Let
align
me
with the
summarize this
feminist
for you.
goals of the
First,
feminist movement and changes
why
the
Japan is
societal
willing
norms.
to keep
Let's
that
take
trade,
team by team.
why
First on
Japan would
OG.
be willing to
OG
pay us
doesn't
back
disprove
when it comes
O's
to heightened
claims as
tensions to
to the
North
same.
Korea.
They
As
simply say the statement that
slideshow said,
the
and as my member
feminist movement
says,
can
it is
leverage
because
positive
Japan's
masculinity to
alliance
garner
and this whole
attention and support. But this
remilitarization
essentially
bases
means
off and
nothing, whereas we
boils
prove
down
to you
to
why.
the
As
U.S.
OG simply
alliance. And
argues,
may I
men will
remind you,
cooperate because they
U.S.
don't
is
feel attacked.
actively
This claim lacks
incentivized to
the
help
actual
South
logical
Korea
backing
in
for this,
matters of
but
North Korea
also we're
matters
the only
because there
bench
are
to even
bigger actors in this
consider
debate
or
like
teach
China and Russia, who
touch
both
base
have bad
upon what
tensions
is the
with
best
more,
alternative to gain
both have bad
most
tensions with the
attention.
U.S.,
Now,
which means
our
the U.S.
logic
being
behind the
actively
prerequisite and
incentivized
entire
to
mechanism
force
behind OG
Japan
points
to
are there.
help with the
Beyond that,
remilitarization,
OG's
and it
target
also
and
means the trade
audiences
between
and
South
scope
Korea and
is
Japan
limited
are still
solely to
relevant matters.
conservative men.
And two,
But what
on
about
Japan
women that didn't
militarization, we
support the
said
feminist
on
movement because they
mechanism
thought the
that there are
movements
both
were too
geographical and
radical
political
and too
benefits to
shifting?
both, very
What about the
detailedly
individuals who have
explained
mixed
only
opinions about the
only
movement?
on
Because we win
CG do we
over OG for this
prove this
simple reason.
mechanism
We
and why
reach a
Japan will
bigger
be
and
willing to
wider
be the
audience through the mechanism that my MG told you. It was that simply
this. This is
feminist
why
movements
we
would
take
gain
credit over
more
these two
traction and
arguments
support because these
instead
seem
of
more
giving credit
realistic
to
to
OG, who
support
only
positive
laundry lists
masculinity.
a
A
bunch
slight
of
tweak
benefits.
in the
That is
narrative where
not
these
debates. We
small
need
changes
reasoning for this.
accumulate to a
Now,
bigger change
on
in the narrative
OO,
rather than trying to wipe away all the
they give for
existing
arguments is
stereotypes
on
because this will be
inconsistent Japan
heavily
promises
backlash,
this ideal.
stigmatized, and ostracized
This was
by
just
society.
mitigated by my analysis
On
before.
LO,
And two,
on
on
OO,
China
O says
relations,
it's
this
inherently
doesn't
not
make
the
any
focus of the
sense as
feminist
we tell
movement to
you
focus
because
on the rights or
intertwined
representation
trade
of men,
relationships,
but the
tensions
current
between
perception of
Japan
feminist
and
movements
South Korea and
further
China won't
de-incentivize
rise. And third,
disinterested
we talk
individuals to
about
be
bad
even
relations between
less
South
further
Korea and
engaged.
Japan. This
True
is
gender
not true. My
equality
member always
requires addressing the harmful
has been
effects of
consistently
both
telling you, but
conventional
CG keeps on
masculinity on men
ignoring
as
this, is
well.
because
While men as a
between
whole may not be
judge
seen as lesser
between
beings
North Korea
and
and
be put into
Japan,
superior
Japan had a
positions,
conflict
that
7
doesn't
years ago,
eliminate the
and
fact
North
that
Korea
there
was
are
currently
stereotypical gender norms
remilitarizing their
imposed on these
338
individuals, and by
388
engaging
line.
men in these
Who is
discussions
more of the
about
bigger
positive
threat here?
masculinity,
Let's
the
weigh this.
movement works
North
towards
Korea is the
collective
current threat
liberation
here.
for
We are
all the
currently
genders, ultimately
resting at war.
benefiting the
War is
women as
not
well
over,
and
and they're
improving the
currently
reputation of
heightened
the
military
feminist
tensions.
movement.
The
If we
only
just
thing we have
decide
with
to
Japan
abolish
is
all the gender roles
constant
that are
trade.
existing in
70
today's society, what would happen?
while
It
we
would lead
acknowledge
to
the
the worsening
conflict
of the
between
feminist movement's
Japan and
reputation,
South Korea,
and
that
the
doesn't mean
from
the
the get-go
conflict is
tries to
more
initiate very
important than that
tangible
of
change,
North
right?
Korea.
But the
This is why our
reputation
winning
of the
wins over
feminist
here, and my
goals is
member's
not the
analysis is
foundation
irrelevant
for
here.
tangible
Now, on
change
the fourth
anyone on
what
any
OO
bench in
says
this
is on
debate can
global
work with.
relations.
And
It says
CG by
that
actually
we should
bringing the
prioritize
feminist
military
movement
over
more
diplomacy,
for
and that
followers
the
and
shift in
supporters wins this.
perception will
This
lose
is to
support.
say
That
that
is
for any
not how
tangible change
politics
occurring
works
on
at
four
all.
of the
This is
benches, We need the social capital, the recognition, and the transparent support in that in today's society's context is not relevant nor present. Obviously, there's media coverage ones that oppose this, negate this, and severely attack this, and this goes as far as to say that we need immense positive support and more of it, and for this to happen, bringing men into this traction is simply beneficial. I'll take your POI later. Therefore, we win over OO, and finally for CO, the whole idea that positive masculinity is still a gender stereotype and characterizes men to be a certain way is a rehash from OO. But the response here is that simply to some extent, gender stereotypes are part of society. It is idealistic to try to get rid of all the gender roles when they're already left an unreasonable start and imprint of society. But CO just talks a lot about how women would further support feminism. So this leads me into my second class, but before that, yes, POI.
Such relations are astronomical. Yes, they are right on that, but
What do you actually do for
what
women
they're doing is
that
they're
actually really
saying that they're just
that
naturally
don't
more
feel like they're
important
actually
because
like
these
polar
impacts
opposites
exist,
for
no
men?
weighing
So what do you do
whatsoever,
for them
no
who
class
actually think
whatsoever here.
that there
So
are
in this
further
debate,
down
I'll do
this
this for you.
spectrum?
But before I do that, yes, I'll take that
We're
POI.
telling you that for women,
Could we get
even
some
if they're
engagement
disengaged
without
with
our
the narrative, they
material
will be
also
engaged,
CR?
considering that we're bringing in a
What I
wider
was doing
range
right
of
now is just
audiences.
proving my opening debate is less
It's mutual
important and
all
why
the four
our
mentions
debate
because
with closing
nobody
is
is
the more
able to
important
actually
material,
bring
which
in
is why
very
I will move
disengaged
on
women who are
to
at the
engage
very
with your
far end
material
of the
right now.
spectrum,
So
but
thank
at
you
least
for
we're
reminding
able
me.
to reach
So
out to a
let's go
bigger
on to the
audience
first class
because
on Japan's
men
ability. Will
who are
Japan be willing to keep their
de-incentivized to
promise
engage
and
with the
guarantee on
feminist movement
benefits?
because they
The
feel
main
like
point
they
of
will
CG
not
was
be able
one.
to,
Look at what
their
Japan
rights
did
will
in
not be able to be
World War II.
advocated
We
for
can't
when
touch
they
that.
are in
Okay,
support of the
parallel
feminist
example with
movement and when
Park
the feminist movement does support positive masculinity, this does happen. So we reach a wider audience. Second class, this debate, which best most effectively eliminates these harmful narratives. Let's establish this from the get-go.
If that was true, then
if men
Pakdong's-
feel supported, it's
Pak-
likely they'll
Pakdong's
support the feminist narrative, and this
democracy
introduction of
policy
positive
should be the-
masculinity
should be
will
the main
bring them
standard of
into
how
garner
South Korea should be
support.
judged for
On CG,
future-
we think
of
that
future
feminist
policies.
movements
That's absolutely not
advocating
true.
for
The history
positive
of a country
masculinity would start
continuously
pushing
change.
a
Japan's
narrative of
democratic
kind
system
and
has always
empathetic men,
continuously
which
changed.
would
That
reduce
means
the
the
counter
history in the World
narrative
War
of
II
toxic
is completely
masculinity of
irrelevant
all
in
of the
today's debate.
benches.
That is not a
Most
point worth
importantly, we
mentioning.
think
And two,
eliminating these
Japan's
harmful
between-
narratives
the
isn't
tension
simply
between Japan and North
abolishing
Korea, I
the
already
narrative and
weighed to
denying
you
it in the first place. It comes with the
more
acknowledgement that we
important enemy
slowly
between North
reduce the
Korea
recognition of
and
these
China-
traditional
and North Korea and
perspectives
Japan. We
and
can
bettering
clearly
the
prove that
reputation
North
and
Korea is the
increasing the
bigger
number of supporters by
enemy here, which
advocating
is
for
why
this
tensions
positive
are less
masculinity
relevant here.
and working
Proper
to
weighing
gender
again. And
equality
three,
to alleviate the
I don't
imposed
understand
conventional
why
rules to
CG
the men
completely
as
rehashed
well.
it and doesn't
And
bring
here's
any
a quick
new
reference to
benefits
the
to the table
OSPO
here.
Ein
All
Chung
they're doing
Ji.
is
Many
giving a
societies
new,
still hold traditional
just a
views
new
on gender
reworded
roles, which
speech of-
undermine these feminist efforts.
oh,
But
oh.
this
Okay,
resistance
now,
from such
on the
powerful
second part of
institutions
why China's
already
trade
make
is
it
worth it.
difficult to
Now, China
affect
won't
these
trade or cut
tangible
off trade
change that
because,
all quote unquote
it's
talks about.
only-
But
it's
suddenly
only upper
withdrawing
hand
these
North
gender
Korea is
roles are
because North
extremely
Korea is
controversial and will
behind
cause
by
more
themselves.
harm than the
Its
actual
own
betterment.
leverage over North
So
Korea is that
engaging
it
men
can
in
turn
these
sides
discussions
to
about
South Korea
positive
and stop giving
masculinity
support
helps
to North Korea
prevent
in
and
the war,
set a
which means
precedent
that
against
China is
backlash
always
against these
incentivized to
feminist
keep
movements,
allies-
because by
allies
creating a
with South
space
Korea.
for men
And
to
now third,
participate in
is
any
sacrificing
discussion of
military
gender
tensions with North
equality,
Korea worth it? My
feminists
members
can
clearly
highlight the
prove to you
understanding and
why-
mitigate
why
any
we are
form of
justified to do
resistance,
so, because
meaning
North
that
Korea was
in
the
any
first one to
historical
militarize the
or
zone
any social
again and
context,
raise
because
military tensions.
feminism has
And
always
two,
evolved to
analysis
address
on
these
national
changing
and
social
political
conditions,
benefits. Therefore,
focusing on the
because of our
positive
extensive
masculinity can be seen a
mechanisms and logic in
continuation
today's
of
debate
this
that have
evolution,
realistic
adapting
impact,
to
we
the needs
clearly
of the
bring this
principles and the
debate
current
home. Thank you
societal
for
landscape.
listening.
So for these
What I
reasons,
find
so proud
extremely
of oppose.
regrettable about today's
Propose.
debate is that the
So, Judge, let me show you again what our previous speaker brings to the table uniquely. There has been a deadlock so far from the opening half on this debate on the participation of males in feminist movements, right? Our speaker says men are more willing to help women and feminism under our rule because we embrace not only women, but rather render these gender spectrums arbitrary in order to advocate for more people, allowing feminism to engage in the equality, to engage and fight for the equality for all, for males who define themselves as feminists and feminine people who like, and also females who define themselves as masculine, right? And we say this would advocate for numerically more people and also include not only females but also men, queers, or whatnot. And I would like to present to you why we easily win over closing governments for two reasons. First of all, I would like to say that closing government's only metric is that they want to add one more way for people to define themselves, which is men to become slightly feminine than they can be in order to advocate, like in order to match up with these feminine like movements or feminine like feminine people, right? And this is their only metric. Whereas in our side, we say our previous speaker has clearly told you we're gonna make these gender spectrums arbitrary by getting rid of the gender roles as a whole, which makes it possible for people to define themselves in infinite different ways, and where they can also all be included in this feminist movement, where they all can feel like they're being supported and included, right? We also say that the CG's point where that we should largely keep gender stereotypes because they keep society stable is contradictory when they are advocating for the demolishment of the gender stereotypes to both help men and women, right? So at best their case is minimal impact because they keep gender stereotypes, or they have minimal impact because they only give one additional a way for men to define themselves, which is minuscule impact compared to our side. No, thank you. First of all, now I'd like to move on to the two clashes in this debate. First of all, which side empowers explicitly women? But before I move on to the comparative, why does feminist movement have to empower women explicitly? Judge, note that the feminist movement is about equality, but also holds a focus on empowering women's rights and not necessarily protecting them from all hazards, like as if it is babying, right? So yes, the priority of movement is to create a tangible social impact, but the opening opposition does not fully feel like why the method and why the process should be also valued in the line of virtues of feminism, right? And so the logic is simple. Promoting positive masculinity is negotiating with masculinity. They are trying to trickle down the power and influence of the males in order to match it with the females in the status quo by adding another way for them to define themselves. By it is no different than like government acknowledging that they have failed to empower women, and therefore they would like to adjust men to cater for the woman, right? Now, in contrast, what is this side opposition's logic, Judge, we say we are the team that promotes the equal start-off for both male and female, getting rid of all stereotypes and all the gender roles, right? By this, we win the clash since we acknowledge that gender is a spectrum that is arbitrary. By this means that we empower women by breaking down the social norms that women should always be housewives who care for their children, right? So this allows women to feel freely to describe themselves to be either feminine, masculine, or even in the middle, or both, right? The impacts of this would be garnering for a society where women are empowered and is in the same or equal standard with other males, right? And even under side government's best case scenario of also garnering for equal narrative, we say that we would still take this debate home because of the process and because of the virtues of feminism, right? Side opposition, by the fact that they are willing to alter males to match these women, they cannot win over the spiritual and aspirational value in this debate, right? They have to prove, no thank you, how the results, which is currently at best a deadlock, would be more efficient on their side, and how it is less efficient on our side. We say there is no engagement on this, so therefore we clearly take this clash home, right? Moving on, by that I would like to move on to the second clash, which is about which side advocates for not only the women but also men and other social parties, right? Judge, note that the very stakeholders of the debate does not only come at the end when we talk about explicitly only women, right? Two reasons why men should also be a part of valid stakes in this debate, right? First of all, taking men into consideration advocates for the utilitarian upend in this debate on which side. The team that proves that men should be advocated in this debate and men also win in this debate, that team should be taking an upend in utilitarian headcount and should be taking an upend in this debate in general, right? Secondly, as this is a social issue debate and not a femininity debate, like males should also be considered as a valid stakeholders. That is no, thank you. That is why opening opposition stance of generally empowering women and disregarding males is generally less charitable compared to what our member of opposition states, right? And our previous speaker tells you that this gender spectrum is not only applicable to women, and by this we mean that none of the teams can win this debate by simplistically arguing for only females, right? For instance, no matter of the title, if it's toxic or positive, masculinity still stays as masculinity, which is still a form of gender constructs on the side government. Therefore, we say it is impossible for side government to take this debate home, right? So at best, so we say, even if side government does make a positive masculinity and a little bit of femininity within how males can define themselves, we say it would be a clear off-bench win, right? And by regarding the gender norms rather arbitrary, by rendering the gender norms rather arbitrary on our side, our previous speaker is the only one who is still valid in this debate until the very end, by the fact that women and men are both able to define themselves freely as they want, right? Obviously, by the very motions, the whole government bench is unable to freely have all genders from being conformed to a norm. So by this we mean that having by the fact that they're having masculinity itself is kind of unfair and is they are not able to win this debate through their logic. And we as closing opposition also wins against opening opposition, as they are only able to explain only advocating for females exclusively. We are the team that takes both masculinity and femininity into consideration in this debate. Proud to oppose.